Hey guys, so the new ban list will probably come in a few weeks or so, and Tri-Brigade is certainly on everyone's radar, so I thought I'd take this time to look at how often Tri-Brigade players win when they resolve Revolt, as well as several other cards. Ideally, I would have wanted to bring this sooner and not before Tri-Brigade may get the axe, but I didn't have the time to get to it, and well, better late than never I guess, so let's just get started. So this analysis will cover only the games where the Tri-Brigade players went first, of which there were 199 games to work with among players ranked in the top 30 on Dueling Book running this deck. In the games where they got to go first, they won about 70% of those games. Now let's look at how often these Tri-Brigade players resolved at least one revolt at any point in the game where they went first, which can be broken down into a few categories. So first, we see that about a quarter of the games, they simply did not even have access to activating Revolt because let's say they just got hand trapped to death, or maybe they even bricked. There was a small instance, a little less than 5%, where the Tri-Brigade players did activate Revolt, but it did not end up resolving because it got negated by something like Ghost Spell. So for the remaining part of the analysis, these two categories will just be considered as not resolved. Then we have about 18% of the time where the Revolt was live, as in the Tri-Brigade players had the graveyard or banish pile loaded and could activate and resolve Revolt, but very often the opponent would just scoop when they know that they can't go through it all. It would be misleading to say that this did not count as resolving, since the Tri-Brigade player just did not have the chance to activate it. So for the rest of the analysis, this will be categorized as resolving Revolt as well. And speaking of resolving, a little over half of the games the Tri-Brigade players did get to fully activate and resolve at least one revolt. So as mentioned earlier, essentially we can categorize it as 69% of the time our top ranked Tri-Brigade players resolved at least one revolt in the game where they went first. When they did get to resolve, they won an impressive 88% of those games, whereas if they could not resolve Revolt, whether they never had access to it or it got negated, then they only won less than a third of the games. Of course, these win percentages are not solely driven by Revolt, because there are many other interacting factors not taken into account, like hand traps being activated or other staples, but at the same time, I think we all know by now how powerful Revolt really is for this deck. Being able to summon Shuriken on your opponent's turn means that you get to banish one of their cards, and even if the opponent didn't have any cards on the field and forced you to activate Revolt early, then being able to link away your Tri-Brigade monsters means that you get to trigger their effects to load the graveyard and add, which really provides a strong follow-up. Some have argued to put this to 1 because that at least reduces the likelihood of hard opening Revolt, which becomes very useful when the players get hand trapped a lot. Now speaking of Revolt, one hand trap that is very strong against the card is Ghost Spell, but the problem is that Tri-Brigade typically can bring out Appaloosa turn 1 to be able to negate that. So I was curious how often they actually bring out Appaloosa on turn 1, which they did about 45% of the time. If they did bring out Appaloosa on turn 1, the Tri-Brigade players ended up winning about 84% of the games, whereas they won just 59% of the games if they did not bring out Appaloosa turn 1. Again, not that the win percentages are solely driven by this card, but it is definitely huge to bring it out because being able to Ghost Spell the Revolt is really crucial to beating Tri-Brigade, and this card, Appaloosa, can protect against that. Now another card that people really want banned is Imperial Order, in which all Tri-Brigade lists play, which you can see from my previous video breaking down all of the Tri-Brigade lists from the YCS that topped. So if Imperial Order did resolve, then the Tri-Brigade players won about 89% of those games. Unfortunately, it was not played too often in the games that I saw, so the sample size is small, but it is a one-of after all. When Order was not activated or did not resolve, then the Tri-Brigade players won about 69% of the games. I sort of expected the game win percentage to be really high when Imperial Order resolved, but we are dealing with small sample sizes, and if we had a large number to work with, I think that the win percentage would remain quite high because this card is just straight up busted, and I personally do hope it gets banned as well. Another popular card that goes along with Imperial Order is Anti-Spell Fragrance, and while this card was not activated that much either, if I were to look at whether Order or Anti-Spell resolved, then the Tri-Brigade players won 82% of the time versus 68% of the time when they did not activate or resolve these cards. So the win percentage with just Anti-Spell Fragrance alone wasn't really all that different than not having it, but small sample size of course, so can't be too confident with that interpretation. Next, let's take a look at how many hand traps the Tri-Brigade players had to play through and their win percentages based on that. So basically, about 60% of the time our Tri-Brigade players had to go through at least one hand trap activated by their opponent at any point in the game and not just turn 1. Of course, pretty rare to have to go through 3 or more hand traps in the same game, occurring a little over 5% of the time. Now if you look at our Tri-Brigade players' win percentages based on the number of hand traps faced in that game, as expected you see their win percentages dip as they had to play through more hand traps, with it being similar for 1 to 2 hand traps, but if they had 3 or more hand traps activated against them, the Tri-Brigade players only won about 45% of the time. So let's try to look at the Tri-Brigade players' win percentages based on specific hand traps that they faced. As seen earlier, if the opponent did not activate any hand traps, then the Tri-Brigade player won about 77% of those games. But if their opponent activated 1 or more hand traps, but not Impermanence or Valor, that win percentage dipped to about 68%. Now if the opponent did activate Imperm or Valor, typically on the first effect of the Tri-Brigade monster to summon from the extra deck, then our Tri-Brigade players won about 64% of those games. So the win percentage actually was not too different whether the opponent had Imperm Valor or any other hand trap, even though I thought that these cards would actually have a really huge impact. Next up we have Ash, where if the opponent activated at least one hand trap that was not Ash, they won 72% of the games, but our Tri-Brigade players won just 56% of the games when the opponent did activate Ash, whether by itself or with other hand traps. Ash is certainly a generic hand trap and there are multiple cards you can hit Tri-Brigade with, but I was surprised that the win percentage differed this much. May not mean too much and could be due to something else, but it was certainly interesting to see. Then we have Gamma, where when our opponents activated any other hand trap, our Tri-Brigade players won 65% of the games, whereas if the opponent activated Gamma, whether by itself or with other hand traps, then our Tri-Brigade players won 71% of the time. So essentially, our Tri-Brigade players actually had a better time when they faced Gamma versus other hand traps. Not sure if this means anything either, since Gamma is certainly powerful and a stronger version of Imperm or Valor, since it also destroys the body. Let me know what you think. It is only based on 14 games where Gamma was activated after all. Finally, we have Nibiru, which I personally did not really side against this deck, but maybe I should. When the opponent activated any other hand traps, the Tri-Brigade players won 67% of the games, whereas the Tri-Brigade players won 60% of the games if the opponent activated Nibiru. Not too big of a difference I suppose, and again only based on 10 games where Nibiru was activated, but it's certainly a card that you can side against Tri-Brigade even though it's not some wombo combo deck, and I do think that it can be quite impactful. While I would have loved to see these numbers for Ghost Spell, unfortunately it surprisingly was not activated too much in the replays that I saw, so I couldn't provide any data for that card. Alright guys, that was it for the analysis of Tri-Brigade. Hope you found that useful. If you did like the video, I'd appreciate it if you could share to your friends, since these videos do take a while from the data collection to analysis and to actually creating the video. Take care guys.